We are live here and the planes are flying in to join us. We are live here on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Instagram here for a session of the New Warehouse podcast. And today we are going to be talking about that dark corner in your warehouse that you don't want to walk by, don't want to look at, want to avoid, and we're going to try and make you want to go and tackle that corner in your warehouse. We're going to be talking about returns today, and I'm going to be joined by Kyle Bertin, and he is the co-founder and CEO at 2Boxes, and we've had him on the show before, of course, but today we're going to focus in and talk about how are we taking those returns specifically for 3PLs and how are we turning them into a profit center, which of course, if you're a 3PL, you want more profit. Who doesn't in business, right? So we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in returns right now. How has the past, quarter been coming out of the holiday season, which is typically that heavy returns time. And we're going to dive into a little bit of how 2Boxes is changing the narrative a little bit around returns and making that corner maybe a little more attractive and finding some gold in there potentially, right? So Kyle, new dad, congratulations. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Really excited to be here again. We always love, being on the show. I think this is my second time, and I think Evan's been on twice as well. So always appreciate you having us.
Of course, definitely. Always happy to get you guys on. I think you guys are taking a great approach to returns and, trying to tackle something that a lot of people don't want to tackle, right? Which we'll talk about today. So I guess let's kick it off here for people that are not familiar, maybe haven't heard the previous episodes or seen you guys around elsewhere. Tell us just kind of brief overview. What is 2Boxes all about?
Yeah. So at 2Boxes, we like to say that we're helping to make returns an asset and a liability for both 3PLs and merchants. Really what that means is that we build what we think is some of the best software in the world for return processing inside of the four walls of the warehouse. And really what we're focusing on is, and speaking of being a new dad, you might hear my daughter screaming in the background.
She's got a couple things to say.
Yeah, she's got some things to say about returns.
Yeah.
No, what I would say is we're really focusing on being everything, the best software that a warehouse can use for everything from a receipt of a return into that inspection and disposition, and making everything very kind of modular and plug and play with both the warehouse technology systems, namely warehouse management systems that are in use in these facilities, but very importantly also the merchant's tech stack. So we integrate with, we don't compete with, the leading RMA platforms out there like Loop Returns, Narvar, Happy Returns, Aftership, the list goes on and on. So at the end of the day, the way that I would really like to break it down is if you go into a warehouse and you hire Kyle as a new return associate and put him in the corner, he should be able to very quickly with 2Boxes software process any return from any of your merchants according to that merchant's unique standard, and in a way that all the data about that transaction can be captured. Kyle processed it, what he processed, the quality of it, the disposition, the time it took for him to do it, the services that were performed for billing purposes, so that everything's just very clean and simple. And, hopefully we can close that gap between kind of return efficiency rates and outbound efficiency rates, which we're proving that we can do right now.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it's a great approach to that, because I remember the first time we connected on the podcast, we talked a little bit about it, and, there was a lot being done for returns kind of outside the four walls, right? But not so much on the inside, right? And that's kind of where you guys are falling into place, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we had this little phrase that we started using last year that I think resonated with a lot of people, which is there's some great technology out there, like I already named, that really helps the merchant serve the end consumer, right? So, Narvar and Loop and many others, they're really in the business of enabling that merchant to have a great return experience for the consumer. And in doing so, they've kind of built like a 5-lane highway of returns that come back to warehouses all across the country and all across the world. And it's really never been better, faster, cheaper to get a return from Kevin's house back to, one of our 3PL's warehouses. The problem is now that 5-lane highway, it kind of like hits a traffic jam in the corner of that warehouse of, oh my gosh, there's so many returns coming back. They all have different processes. I don't know what's what. I can't train people efficiently on this process. I can't execute what my brands are asking me to do intelligently and in a way that I can make money. And that's really where, we're trying to help serve both sides of that equation, right? We tend to mainly serve 3PLs, although we do serve some brands directly today. But the goal here is, if you can make that return section efficient and profitable, that's great for the 3PLs, but it's also really great for the brands in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's great to hear that. And, being able to, I mean, just the process you kind of described there, I mean, just sounds like headache, right? It sounds tedious, right? But being
It
able
is.
to, yeah. I mean, I've managed a couple returns departments in my career, and yeah, it's not fun generally. So, I think that, it's very interesting how you're applying, kind of these processes and this way of looking at it and then creating opportunity for that. So I guess let's understand here before we dive in, just kind of exactly how you're doing that and how this is enabling 3PLs to, increase those profits potentially. Let's talk a little bit about, what are we seeing in returns right now? We're just kind of coming out toward the end of Q1 here, and out of the holiday season, obviously. So, typically the highest point for returns as well. So how did this year look? What are you guys seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it was another banner year for returns. I mean, effectively, if you go back and look at the last about 5 to 10 years, returns have effectively about 8x in volume in the United States on a gross merchandise value basis in that time period. They've come back a little bit, like on a growth rate perspective from COVID. COVID was really like the peak, year in 2020. But now we're still seeing very consistent, like 15 to 30% growth kind of year over year in returns on average. With 2 boxes, we saw that from Q1 of last year to today, we were about 3x, about 3 to 3.5x on volume through 2 boxes. Now, a lot of that was, our own growth. But if you kind of just extrapolate and you look at it on like an individual brand level, what are some of these brands doing? You tend to see around these peak holiday periods, most brands are somewhere between 30 to 50%, kind of volume growth in those peak periods in the return section on the low end, and on the high end, it can be 2 to 3x. So you see a lot of these brands are highly, highly seasonal. They really take advantage of, BFCM and Christmas holidays, and they push a lot of volume through. So Q1 is like the return Super Bowl, as I like to say it.
Yeah.
Q4 to Q1, 2 boxes as a business on the volume side was up about 40%. So we see some pretty large growth in that time period. And what I would say the underlying all of this, I think there's been a huge shift in the last year to year and a half, particularly on the merchant side of, it feels to a lot of merchants right now, I think that the world is sort of conspiring against them to increase their inventory costs.
Yeah.
From tariffs that were obviously in the news again today, which is crazy to me.
It's
but
like every hour is changing.
Yeah. So tariff changes, the costs of goods on the manufacturing side, increasing, and then really if you look at labor, like warehouse costs and warehouse rents, they still just keep climbing. And so on the labor side and the space side, those costs are getting passed off on the merchants through the form of higher and higher prices in most cases. And so I think a lot of merchants now, it's like the volume is there. It's always been there. It's huge. But I think a lot of merchants that are pointing the finger at the 3PLs to say, hey, that's actually my inventory sitting in the corner. And if I cannot get that inventory back to stock quickly, that has a huge impact on my cash position. And like, if you're not going to be a partner to me in solving that problem, then I'm going to go find a partner who can.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that's a great point, right? Because it is such I mean, it is inventory, definitely. And, some of it maybe is viable. Some of it maybe is not, you're not quite sure. And that's where kind of that mountain to climb around returns, kind of comes into play. Right. So, looking at that and, I saw post from you recently, maybe in the last couple of days here, where you're talking about the growth of 2 boxes, which is awesome, definitely. So congratulations to you and the team on that. But you've onboarded around 30 3PLs, 200 merchants onto the platform. So tell us a little bit about, kind of what is that unlock that's happening, like what's clicking with the 3PLs, what's clicking with the merchants, and why are they coming to 2 boxes in the first place?
Yeah. No, great question. I think, when Evan and I started the company, maybe I've told you this story before, but, just if you'll, indulge me, like
Sure.
we spent the first almost 5 months of the company, we didn't write a single line of code.
Mm,
We didn't have an MVP. There was nothing, right? Like we went out and what we did was we effectively like kind of begged, borrowed, and stole our way into fulfillment centers. And
sure.
we just tried to learn as much as we could. Like I legitimately got a job processing returns for a brand here in Denver that self fulfills, and I
Mm,
like went in every day for 2 weeks and like did the job and learning as much as I could about how the process worked or really didn't work. And what we came away with was there were sort of these two big gaps that were affecting both 3PLs and brands, and more so when we started on the 3PL side, but we're seeing that we can do a lot for the brand. Um, and so the first big gap is the 3PL's warehouse management system can do a lot of things. They've been very thoughtful. Most 3PLs have been very thoughtful about selecting a warehouse management system that's good for their business.
mm,
Um, but if you go and look at those, and it's not a knock on any of the warehouse management systems, I think it's just the reality of it, of those
yeah.
pieces of technology you have to do a lot, right? If you go and look at it, it's the returns like module, if you want to think about it in the WMS, has typically been an afterthought, and it's like very bare bones,
Right.
right? Um, and on the so that's kind of problem one. Problem two is the brands choose the returns technology provider that they work with, like full
Mm,
stop. If
okay.
you are a brand at any meaningful scale and you've decided, hey, we can't keep up with returns, like generating RMAs, like basically via like an email or like,
Yeah.
kind of duct tape and bubblegum, approach, they go out and they select a, after ship or a loop or a Narvar or a redo or a happy returns, whatever they do. Right. And so that's all brand facing tech. And in the vast majority of cases, the 3PLs are not integrated with that, and that brand facing tech effectively ends at the time that that return is delivered to the facility, right? So once a return shows up, like Loop and others wave to the 3PL like good luck, right?
Mm,
And then the warehouse management system is supposed to take over, but what really happens is the return process is very, very bespoke. It very much differs based on the brand and the category of goods that the brands are selling and the combination of those two, because
mm,
even two footwear brands might not have the same returns SOP, and in most cases they actually don't have a very similar SOP. And so if you start to break this down, you're like, okay, well, how the heck do I train, if I'm running a multi-tenant operation and I have 20 brands that sell 5 categories of goods, and those are changing all the time, at a minimum I have like 100 SOPs to manage, and I have to manage that across a labor pool that is usually relatively low skilled and going to turn over a lot. And so that was really the problem that we saw, was how could we build a great piece of tech that solved both those problems, right? Of integrate very easily into the brand tech stack and integrate very easily to the warehouse tech stack, and kind of bridge this gap between RMA providers and WMS providers in an elegant and simple way. And that's effectively, I think, it took us, frankly, probably a year and a half to like prove to people that this was
yeah.
possible and that this really benefited folks. And I think now that we have the data and the case studies, and we really understand where we can help people win, we've been able to grow, relatively quickly.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's been great to see that growth too, since the first time we had you on the podcast a while ago. So really interesting there, and I'm curious. I mean, it sounds like these brands, like you said, they're under pressure in terms of like their inventory position and the cash, and then recognizing that oh, there's inventory in there, right? Which means I have cash in there potentially, right? And it sounds like the brand is kind of coming to the 3PL saying like, hey, you got to handle this for me, right? So it sounds like it maybe in some instances that could create some potential tension or friction between the 3PL and the merchant. I mean, are you hearing that as like a pain point on the 3PL side, where they're saying like, oh, well, like clients are like trying to demand us to do more with returns, but we're kind of stuck and limited with what we can do? And I mean, what are you hearing
Yeah, I mean, this is extremely common,
there? Mm,
right? And it's becoming, I'd say, much more common right now with everything going on in the macro environment of, if you're a brand, especially in like fashion, footwear, apparel, high return rate categories, you probably have a 25 to 40, maybe 50% return rate, I mean, there are brands on 2 boxes that have 60 to 70% return rates, which is insane, right? But it's the truth. And so if you're a brand like that and you have 30% of your sales being returned and 30% of your inventory coming back, and now it's harder and harder to purchase new inventory and get it into the country at a cost, right? Like that inventory value is huge. And so there's so many brands now are just going to their 3PLs and saying like, hey, like you got to help me solve this. So that trend is definitely increasing. And the most common thing that we see, frankly, that we really are trying to help a lot of our 3PL partners get out in front of and just be better about from kind of day one with a new customer is, and this really goes to the value of 2 boxes that I can unpack a little bit more here later, but
Sure.
we're really helping a lot of these 3PLs where the tale as old as time right now is sales sold a deal that had a bunch of returns. And they're super excited about that because maybe it's a 7-figure outbound client and it's got a 25% return rate, but we'll be okay, right? And then the solutions team or the ops team is, and usually both are raising their hands going like, how in the world are we going to deal with this? And then sales gets like kind of stung of like, hey, don't sell high return rate clients anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And then they're like, well, wait, what do you want me to do? Like, I can't just go out after like all the cosmetic and packaged goods brands. Right.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do bulk and we don't want to do electronics. So like, I can't do flat pack and I can't do shoes. Like, where am I going to get all this volume from? And so I think that's a very common story that we hear that we help people kind of unwind right away. And then because we can come in with 3PLs and we can start kind of small and then scale quickly because of how we've designed everything that we do, we get a lot of 3PLs that come in, try us out for maybe a problematic situation and go, oh, this is excellent. We want to like standardize our returns offerings on 2 boxes. So that's one of the most exciting things with me is the growth that we see within 3PLs is really strong because we come in, like, I get it. When I talk to a new 3PL, I'm like, you have no reason to trust me. You've probably bought software before that you churned from because it didn't deliver the value that it said it would.
Yeah.
Like, well, if you want to try it out. And I'm really proud right now. We have 100%, pilot conversion rate where people try it out, They convert, and then they scale really, really quickly.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that's such an interesting scenario you described there, right? Is that like, sales goes out and they're like, oh, we just landed this big account, right? And then operations is like, this is not so great because we're going to get so many returns, right? And then it's like kind of this interesting like internal probably like tension as well, right? So I guess tell us a little bit about, because on the operations side, like it's kind of, we talked about some of the pain points there and why people, kind of, commonly look at returns as like this dirty part of the operation I don't want to necessarily deal with, right? And it's going to cost me money to do all this extra processing, and it's not necessarily standardized. And like you said, maybe there's 50 different brands, 50 different SOPs. Like, how do we navigate that, right? And so I guess tell us a little bit about, how can you now like leverage when you get these returns standardized, right, and into a system like 2 boxes, how can you now leverage those returns as not like just a cost, right, and looking at it with like kind of a stink eye in a sense, right, but looking at it from the view of like, ooh, like there's value there for us, right, as a 3PL that we can drive for existing clients or maybe even, future potential clients as well.
Yeah, I'll talk about a few areas.
Sure.
One is training, 2 is efficiency, and 3 is really like, kind of value-added services or like enhanced returns offerings. And if you really kind of boil down the returns P&L for a 3PL, it's just like any other P&L, right? It's like basically the number 2 things that are going on the input side on the costs are labor and real estate, right? And most, and then the other thing is that when you're training a new returns associate, when we talk to 3PLs, it tends to be much harder to train a returns associate to start than anybody else. So what we see is first and foremost, when you're going to onboard, just kind of going through the life cycle of 2 boxes, if you're going to onboard a new employee, or maybe you're onboarding a new brand, you have to train the return staff on the new brand SOP, right? We see that tends to take like minimum kind of like 1 week to get somebody up to speed. And in a lot of cases, we hear 2 weeks or longer from some of our 3PLs, depending on the complexity of the process.
Yeah.
The vast majority of our 3PLs right now are onboarding new staff and training them and getting them to productive levels in like a single day. So we actually launched the second largest merchant that's on 2 boxes right now is a pretty well-known footwear brand. We launched a net new facility with a new 3PL for them in Ohio back in like March of last year.
Mm-hmm.
They told us that within the end of the first week, that 3PL's efficiency in the process was running 30% higher than their previous 3PL within 1 week.
That's crazy.
Right? I've never seen the product before, never seen, never worked with that client before. And so sort of the intuitive nature of the product that we deploy makes it very simple to go in and train somebody who, doesn't speak English as a first language in most cases, is, pretty new to the job and is trying to deal with a complex process. So that's kind of number one, is that training efficiency. And think as a 3PL about how many times you're training and retraining staff in the return section on an annual basis. And there's significant dollars there, right? Then the second one is efficiency. So when we meet 3PLs, I would say the most common, one of the first questions we ask is like, hey, do you guys know how efficient your return section is? Right? Most people have like outbound metrics very easily attainable in their WMS or like on screens in the warehouse. And then you go in the return section, there's like a whiteboard, right? Of like, team Kyle did this many returns today, right? Yeah. I mean, we literally were in a warehouse 2 weeks ago for an enterprise 3PL where there's somebody was like ticking by hand the number of returns that they did that day. So yeah, I mean, we see all kinds of wild stuff. And if you can get people to determine their efficiency, typically you hear somebody somewhere between the range of like 10 to 20 units per hour is like kind of the range that we hear. So usually somewhere in the range of like 5 to 10 times slower than outbound.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely.
Okay. So that's where we come in, and our median right now in 2 boxes across all the categories that we serve is about 42 units per hour.
Oh, wow.
And so
most
3PLs, when we meet them, are like, that's not possible. How are you doing this? And then it's like, okay, we'll go show you. And really what it comes down to is like everything you can think of like needing to do in the return process, you get to do in one pane of glass with 2 boxes. So you don't have to look up, this brand's returns in the Narvar portal and this brand's returns in the Loop portal. And you don't have to have 5 different SOPs out that you have to remember. You don't have to go to the WMS to print a label for this product that came back without a hang tag. And you don't have to go and take a photo with your personal device. It's like everything's in the flow, right?
Yeah.
And so when you add up all those times of like, oh, you save 20% here and 10% there, it actually becomes very, very meaningful, right? So that's number 2. And then the third is really, before I move on to the third, because the third is more the revenue side. So on the cost side, right? Most of our customers on the 3PL side, they're somewhere in the range of like 20 to 25 bucks an hour. Let's call it like fully loaded wage rate. So that really breaks down to like, call it 40 cents a minute, right?
Yeah.
If you're running, 10 UPH, right there, you're basically like over $2 a unit, right? And most people can't process, returns that quickly, or aren't billing significantly more than that, right? So your margin in the returns for a lot of 3PLs we meet are like, well, I'm just trying to break even on the return, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the goal. But hey, suddenly if I take you to 30 units per hour, and now your costs are 80 cents for processing that unit, right? And you're charging $2 a unit, $3 a unit. Wow, that starts to look like crazy margin on a 3PL basis.
Right.
And then you think like, oh, well, my brand's going to be upset about this, right? But then that moves into the second side, which is like the enhanced return services, right? Which is, remember, the brand returns are inventory, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot of 3PLs who are employing, value-added service programs and refurbishment programs, like with 2 boxes logic in the flow of, oh, maybe here's a real story. There's a brand that we work with. It's women's apparel and primarily swimwear.
Okay.
Right? The number one reason that they were donating items in the warehouse was people would try on the swimwear and it fits pretty tight, and there would be a little deodorant mark like on the kind of strap.
Yeah. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
This brand was, before working for their 3PL, was working with 2 boxes, was donating about $250,000 worth of inventory per month because of like deodorant stains. And the 3PL was like, oh,
wow.
Well, we could put it into the SOP in 2 boxes that every time there's a deodorant mark, instruct the associate on how to try to spot clean it. If they spot clean it, they can document the cleanliness of the item and they can return it to stock. they can charge a little bit more, right? 3PL is like, hey, I'll charge a little bit more because I'm doing that service. Brands like, that's fantastic, because now instead of throwing away 250K of merchandise, I'm going to throw away 50K of merchandise.
Yeah.
And everybody wins in that transaction. So that's really when you stack these things up. It's like, hey, the brands are going to get better service, whether you're making 0% margin or 50-60% margin on returns. The brand really isn't going to care that much, because they're going to be like, hey, great, I'm getting more inventory back to stock from a reliable service partner who's helping me lower the cost of my overall book of business.
Yeah. I mean, I think the numbers like that you shared are just kind of like staggering, right? I mean, to see the stark difference, right, between the baseline process, right, which is like the traditional way of doing it, and seeing like that, almost like 2x improvement in productivity. I mean, that's huge, right? And I think, you touched on something in the beginning there, your first point, which I think is a really important one, is the training aspect as well, from the 3PL perspective, because returns, when you think about it, like, there's the processing, which maybe is similar to, processing like at a pack station or something, but getting that inventory back in and system stuff maybe is, not so hard. But then it comes down to all those different inspections, right? And understanding, is this product still viable? Is it good? Does it go to donation? Can it go back on the shelf? Or does it get thrown away, unfortunately, which happens a lot, right? And that training aspect, I think, is huge, because it does take like a certain mindset of somebody, to be focused and be thorough in the inspection. And with the way turnover is in a lot of warehouses, I mean, 2 weeks to train somebody and then maybe they're gone in a month, right, is kind of like a lot of waste, right? So I mean, it's great that you're able to reduce and cut that training time to get that up and running. And I think, seeing that productivity increase is huge as well, because that's where you're kind of turning into that profit in a sense, and finding that value. And now you're delivering that value to, the merchant or your client as a 3PL, right? And at the end of the day, because they're saving more inventory potentially, right? And then they're also, getting this inventory process faster too as well. And I think it's interesting you touched on the metric there, because I remember we we were doing the same thing, like in my department in the past too. Like, we had the whiteboard, and when I was given the returns department, didn't ask for it.
No one asked for it.
Yeah, didn't ask for it, was given. They're
Yeah.
like, oh, can you figure out like some metrics here, right? The only metric I was given was like, oh, make sure that we don't have any returns that are older than 10 days, right? And I'm like, 10 days? Like, what? Like, that's a long time. And they're like, yeah, like, that's it. And of course, that was the one department where they would always like cannibalize labor for other
Oh yeah.
departments when they're busy, right? So you want to get that attention, and then it's like, oh, well, why are we past 10 days? And I'm like, you took everybody except for like one person, right? So
Yeah.
tracking that stuff and being able to see that, and that improvement, like in the speed and velocity that you can go through there, I think makes a huge difference, like all around the operation, for the other departments too, and support potential there as well. I'm curious, I mean, are you seeing 3PLs that, they're seeing potentially value in, having 2 boxes, and then are they using that as like a potential like marketing tool as well to attract merchants and
Yeah.
brands that maybe are either already on 2 boxes, or they know have a high returns volume, and now they're looking at it like, ooh, like this is an opportunity versus a challenge?
Yeah. No, 100%. And I'm really glad to see this kind of pick up momentum. I mean, obviously I'm biased and it benefits our business, but
Yeah.
I really think that it benefits 3PLs and merchants as well. So we have several 3PLs, right? Actually, just this week, a relatively new customer of ours emailed our marketing team saying like, hey, can we get a bunch of support? We're trying to put together some new marketing materials
Mm.
for our sales team to go out and talk about 2 boxes in the sales process. And of course, we're happy to oblige.
Yeah.
I'd say the best example I can give, the second customer that we ever signed was a company called GoBolt.
Okay.
And they're based in Canada. Mark Ang, the CEO, and Jared Stewart, the SVP of commercial. They've been just huge friends, partners, champions of what we're doing. They've, I think, number one, they've signed a lot more customers with higher return rates because they can talk about the process that they have now, powered by 2boxes. They even actually they have a new website entirely devoted to reverse logistics, and they'll actually take clients now on like reverse logistics assignment only, right? Like, hey, we'll take your returns and we'll deal with them even if we don't have your fulfillment. And I'd say that's kind of like the second order impact, I like to call it, of 2boxes, right? The first impact, right, is, okay, well, Kevin, we're gonna be able to run that building more efficiently, more intelligently, more profitably, right? And so that corner of the warehouse that nobody wanted to talk about actually becomes something that, like, on the tour, we have 3PLs like taking their clients past the 2boxes, set up in the warehouse, and like, hey,
instead of avoiding the returns,
like,
right? Yeah.
check this out. This is what we do, and why we're a great service provider for you as a customer who does footwear or flat pack or jewelry or all kinds of different items that we're processing now. So that's kind of that first order impact, right? Is like, this becomes a strength, not a weakness, for a 3PL, right? And then the second order impact, right, is now people are starting to sell this and market this, right? Which means retention goes up within the existing base, which is huge for customers, right? Churn is the enemy for any business, but especially 3PLs. And then the second is you attract more customers that you can serve well. Right? You're like, hey, we know we can do the fulfillment for this. We can do the return processing for it as well. And that, I think, is starting to see a lot of our customers like have significant increases in their RFP win rates. And we'll even do things like, we do the old startup adage of like, do things that don't scale, right? Like we'll get on calls like almost weekly with 3PLs who are bidding on new business, and we'll do a demo, like a custom demo of, hey, customer, here's your footwear merchant, here's a demo of what your returns will look like in 2boxes and all the amazing features that you'll get because you're working with J Group or Global or Stored, whoever it might be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's huge too. I mean, to be able to see that as a value, and like you said, instead of trying to avoid the tour going past like the returns, historically, right? Now it's like, oh, like, check out our returns. Like, you want to see our returns. Like, it makes a big difference. So
the number of sales guys I talk to, when they've told me, pretty point blank, like, hey, when we're touring a new customer on the client, we basically like pack up the return section and hide it. So they don't even see it.
Yeah, definitely. I've certainly seen that in the past before as well.
Put it up in the racking.
Yeah. Or like, oh, we can't go back there. They're working on something right now, so we need to
electrical install.
Need to avoid that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think that's huge, definitely. And I'm curious along those lines too, because there's some 3PLs certainly I've seen like where they're like, oh, like, we don't do returns, right? And then there's other companies that just focus strictly on returns processing, like that's what they do. So I mean, do you think over time, do you see where 3PLs are going to be changing their perspective on that? And does that challenge some of those companies that focus only on returns? I mean, what does that look like, kind of the landscape there?
We do serve a couple businesses today, actually. I think 3 now that are just like fully focused returns only. Actually, one of our first customers is a guy named Sonny Bird at Rock Returns. So shout out to Sonny, because he took a big chance on us, and he's just an awesome guy. But I think, like, I'll say 2 things that are a little bit in conflict, but I believe them both. So the first is, there's so much returns volume that I think a lot of these very specific, bespoke returns processing businesses are going to continue to, run great businesses and attract clients where they're a fit for them. And there's a bunch of them out there, and I think that'll continue. I do think they'll see some pressure, but I think there's a lot of market out there for them. But what I think you're going to see, and you're starting to see, is I'm a big believer that there's a effectively kind of 2 big trends happening in the 3PL ecosystem that I'm paying close attention to. The first is that 3PLs are under a lot of pressure right now to kind of fight for the same market share. That a lot of the upstart 3PLs that I think a lot of the more entrenched legacy 3PL providers used to kind of turn their nose up at are starting to win a lot in the market, because they have designed everything they're doing from a tech perspective, right? I know, by the way, and I don't want to make this like tech wins over the long term, because the truth is, I think we've talked about this before, like, running a warehouse is really hard. That's why we don't run warehouses, right? Like, it's really, really difficult.
Mm.
But I think that you can hire for that, and you can scale that expertise really quickly. If you're hire the right people and you're methodical and you execute well. I think a lot of the new kind of upstart tech players are embracing the modern kind of omni-channel brand, right? And where those
Mm.
brands are selling, because guess what? They're selling everywhere.
Yeah.
And they need better, storefront integrations. They need better OMS integrations. They need more, and kind of modern software. And so I think trend one I'm watching is, I think a lot of the new kind of tech powered enabled 3PLs, they've gone through their learning curves, and a lot of them raised too much money and had to kind of struggle through and fight. But I think
Yeah.
a lot of them are starting to make it and winning a lot of business right now because of this tariff impact and because they can move fast, right?
Mm.
Much faster than, I mean, I talked to a 3PL last week who said that takes them like on average 6 months to onboard a new merchant because of how they approach things on the tech side. And like,
Mm.
most brands are not going to wait 6 months. Like, I'm sorry to tell you that, unless it's
Yeah.
like a contract facility for a major enterprise retailer, they're not going to do that. So I think that's trend one. Trend two that's related to trend one is the enterprise scale 3PLs, I believe, are all investing very aggressively in the mid-market and in some cases even the SMB right now.
Mm.
So if you go down the list, right, like, DSV started an e-commerce business recently. NFI started an e-commerce business. Ascendant
Yeah.
just started an e-commerce fulfillment business. GXO acquired PFS. I think you're going to see Radial is, rumored to be launching something very much focused on the mid-market.
Mm.
And so I think you're starting to see that these large players are realizing that there's growth and volume and parcel spend to be had in that mid-market, and they're coming for it. But I think what they are going to start to see, if they haven't already, is that the like legacy, Manhattan infrastructure or Blue Yonder infrastructure that they're running on, and kind of a lot of the other things that they're doing from a tech perspective, doesn't match well with a multi-tenant, mid-market facility. And so I think that that's where you're going to see a lot of investment in new tech and a lot of investment, particularly, I believe, for us in returns tech, because if you're coming out of the mid-market, you're coming after growth. You mean more often than not, you're coming after like high growth scaling Shopify brands. And I think that's kind of the third, if I have to throw in one third trend to watch, it's that I'm long Shopify right now. I
Yeah.
think Shopify is going to continue to win in the enterprise segment because they're just innovating at a faster pace than their competition is.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting to see that, right? Because, that mid market, like you said, and I think, some of those brands are merchants, right, that are falling in, that smaller mid market category. I feel like, a lot of them are kind of, they're poised to like become big, right? And I think there's so many different avenues to sell through now, and things like TikTok shop,
Yeah.
right, is can just overnight like just cause like a huge spike, right, in volume. And I think from a 3PL perspective, it's kind of like some, it's almost like an investor perspective, right? It's like, you gotta take some bets on some of these smaller brands, like take them on, and all of a sudden, like, oh, boom, like they're huge, right? And so I'm curious, I mean, around some of that, some of the things that are like happening now, like around like virality of product, like in those spikes in demand, and even some of the stuff that's going on like with the tariffs that you mentioned earlier. I mean, do you see that having any kind of, whether it's positive or negative impact in terms of returns, or the volume surrounding returns?
Yeah, 100%. One other big, kind of like thing in the enterprise that I totally left out was, DHL obviously acquired Inmar.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that's, I think, a huge thing. And one other trend here that'll go into the kind of impact on returns is, I think you're starting to see some of the really intelligent enterprise players who are moving into this mid-market aggressively because they believe that they can win, number one, but number two, they believe that can be kind of an onboard mechanism for their core business, right?
Mm.
Which is contract logistics for enterprise brands, right?
Yeah.
So if you find the next brand that, like, whatever Taylor Swift starts wearing, and then their volumes go like 10x overnight,
Yeah.
and then they become like a huge player, and now they are, hey, you're like, I'm insert 3-letter acronym 3PL here, and I'm going to take you from a multi-tenant facility to a contract facility. or contract facilities, right? I think that you're going to see a lot of people investing in that, and I think they're right to do so. But what we're starting to see is in the returns ecosystem right now, especially driven by tariffs, right? Like, to really simplify it, like, all tariffs are doing right now for these merchants is increasing the cost of their inventory. Like, full stop. Like, Warren Buffett said about tariffs, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, that like the tooth fairy doesn't pay for them, right? So like the brands pay, pay for it, and then the consumer pays for it. Like, whatever else people want to say about that, that's just not true, right? So like, okay, the merchants ultimately are passing off these costs on the consumer. They're looking for ways that are strategic to lower the costs of these, these return services. What we're seeing right now is there's a big trend of, historically, a lot of brands that used to outsource, fulfillment to, or not really outsource, but situate fulfillment across the border in Mexico or Canada, are now saying like, well, shoot, when you add in all the tariff math, that actually doesn't really make sense. Why don't we move everything into, the US, and let's try to find a provider who can deal with the returns as well? Because, frankly, a lot of brands were taking advantage of, like, Mexican fulfillment providers, let's just say, weren't really focusing on returns, because the cost of receiving that inventory back, like, combined with just the labor arbitrage in Mexico, like the math on like really optimizing that return stream wasn't as impactful as it is with US labor, right? And so now it's like, okay, well, shoot, like, because I've taken away the sourcing advantage, right? If I have to replenish the 20% of stuff that comes back by sourcing new inventory from China, and all my loopholes are taken away, like, well, crap, now I'm just kind of stuck with this. Like, I got to figure out how to deal with the returns. So we're seeing a lot of demand right now, brands coming in saying, hey, can you help me with the returns? Can you put me in touch with a 3PL who can give me a fantastic outbound service, but also deal with my returns? And I think that's going to be a huge tailwind for every 3PL that gets on board over the next, 5 to 10 years of, hey guys, we can do your fulfillment with our, kind of our eyes closed. And we can do your returns really, really well, because we've set up a great process and technology for it.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, I'm curious. I mean, these brands that are, basically shipping across the border, whether it's from Mexico or Canada, I mean, how are they traditionally handled returns, right? Because it sounds like you're kind of saying like, oh, it doesn't make sense for us to ship it back over the border. So I mean, are they returning to like a domestic 3PL typically, or how is that normally handled?
There's really usually 2 flavors. The first is, well, I'll say there's 3 flavors. The first one is really only applicable based on the category of goods. The first one will be like, just keep it. This is actually very common for like US brands who sell in non-core geographies, right? Like, think a US brand selling shoes in the UK.
Okay.
A lot of times they're actually fulfilling from the US. And if it comes back from a UK customer, they're like, donate it, just keep it. It's fine. So that's kind of flavor 1. Flavor 2 is send it to a dedicated returns provider. But I think increasing a lot of brands are like, I just don't want to manage 2 3PLs and deal with the inventory transfers and so on and so forth. And so that one really only works, I think, if you're at like, a reasonable scale, and you can negotiate good pricing. And then the third is, the most common one that we see, but it just adds time and complexity. And I'd say it lowers your overall recovery rate, which is let's say you're using a 3PL in Mexico, they'll send your returns to effectively a cross-docking facility in San Diego. They'll consolidate them all there. Then they'll ship them over the border into Mexico. Then they'll be received, inspected, dispositioned in that warehouse. But it adds a lot of cost and complexity because there's another customs clearance. And then the other thing is that because of the Section 321, legalities, you actually, fun fact, you cannot throw away a return in Mexico.
Really?
It has to be re-exported out of the country. So like, if somebody brings in, because that's the de minimis or the 321 exemption, is like, it has to pass through. It cannot stay in Mexico. And so if you bring something back into Mexico, and you can't just throw it away in the trash can there, you have to throw it away in the trash can in San Diego. And so, if you have let's say something like 80% of your returns go back to stock when they're received, and 20% of them have to be trucked out of the country, it's adding more cost. So I think, like, for a long time, a lot of people were just like, hey, this is a trade arbitrage. I'm going to milk it for as long as I can. But we're seeing a lot of people scramble right now to kind of decide if that's going to be the future of their business or not. So we'll see. It's interesting times for sure. But I think 3PLs, like anything else, simplicity and customer service wins, right? So if you can go into a 3PL, or sorry, if you can go to a merchant as a 3PL and say, hey, we got a best in class return offering, and we can, we can do your fulfillment well. I think that over the long run wins.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting. I didn't never thought about that or was aware about not being able to throw stuff away in Mexico. It sounds like there's an opportunity to have like a dumpster business at the border, maybe potentially to reduce the
Well,
transportation.
I think there are dumpster businesses, but I think they end up funneling merchandise into marketplaces that brands don't want it going into. But
I'm sure. Yeah. Interesting there. So, and on I'll pause here too. I mean, if anybody's listening, you guys have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments here. Is that a question we have there in the back?
that's not my dog. So you guys are getting to know my whole family here.
That's a dog. There we go. Family affair here. So, yeah. So I guess additionally, I mean, on the tariff side, right? If we see, like you said, that cost ultimately is going to get passed down, right? And we're probably going to see, prices on some goods increase there. What does that do for returns volume? I mean, do you see that? I guess one, do you see that maybe sales, I imagine, will dip a little bit, right, if prices are higher? But do you also see like a spike in kind of buyer's remorse a little bit and maybe returning more?
Yeah, wow, I love that you brought this up. We've actually been discussing this, my co-founder, a lot internally, and with a couple of our other employees as well. So the short answer is I don't know for sure. The data that I have leads me to believe that returns volumes will stay steady and likely increase. And why I say that is if you actually go back and you look at e-commerce retail sales during the last real recession, 08, 09, effectively retail only dropped, US e-commerce only dropped about 5-6 percentage points. And then at its worst, so the trough was in late 2008, early 2009,
Okay.
and then it rebounded back to the level it was before the recession within about 9 months. So I think, could we see a 5 to 10% pull kind of drop in e-commerce sales? I think yes. That's potential. The history be my guide. Right now, we haven't had a lot of recessionary periods in the U.S. in the last 50 years, so it's tough to extrapolate a lot of data. But I think you can see some demand softness. The reason I think returns will stay steady is I believe two things. The first is brands are not going to create overly stringent return policies during a recessionary period because it's friction before the sale. And I think that'll lead to two things. One is that average people will return more than they did before. And I believe that because during COVID, people bought a lot and they returned a lot more. That was the biggest spike in returns because I think people were online, they were buying things, and they're starting to say, hey, can we actually return this? Because maybe, $100 item to me 12 months ago when I was feeling flush and everything was good, wasn't that big of a deal if it wasn't perfect. But now if it's not perfect, I'm going to return it. So I think that's kind of trend one that I believe we'll see. The second is, and it's unfortunate to say this, but it's the reality. One of the most common forms of retail fraud today is through returns. And I believe that you'll see people, especially with buying power stretched, will take to abusing and in some cases defrauding, retailers via return policies as a way to get goods at a lower cost, the five-finger discount, so to speak.
Yeah.
We see that a lot today. Just to put it in perspective, about $110 billion worth of fraud in the retail ecosystem related to returns last year. So I believe that that's going to be a big trend as well that'll ultimately push return rates up even if demand dips. We'll see. I like to be a little bullish on returns given that I'm the CEO of returns business, but yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I'm excited. I'm not excited, but I'm a little anxious to see how that plays out if it does play out.
Yeah, it's very interesting there because I imagine too, higher price, and then either it's like, oof, I shouldn't have bought that, right? I shouldn't have spent that. Let me return it, or it's like, the wife or husband are kind of like, why did you buy that? Like, we need to return that, right? The price is too high or something like that, right? So it'd
Yeah.
be interesting to see like how that handles that. And you touched there a little bit on returns fraud. We have a question here.
Oh, okay, great.
So how does Two Boxes handle return fraud and abuse, and what innovative solutions do you use to minimize its impact on retailers?
Yeah. Uh, Great question. So at Two Boxes, there's really a few things that we're helping merchants with, right? I think kind of starting from basic levels, the first is actual end-to-end visibility on the return. And what I mean by that is because we integrate with, Loop and Narvar and others, for instance, we know the customer return, like who the customer is that's returning the item, and what the customer says about it. So let's say that, Kevin's a good returner and he says, I'm returning this polo shirt because it just didn't fit. And it comes back to the warehouse and he returned the right unit of inventory and it's in good condition to be resold as new, right? Two Boxes tracks all that data, right?
Okay.
And so we see a lot of good returners. The vast majority of returners are good returners. The unfortunate thing is that there's probably somewhere in the range of like 3 to 5% of returners in Two Boxes who are serial abusers, right? Who try to come in and abuse return brands through the return policy. So the most common thing is like, empty box return, right? Where somebody returns a pair of, old shoes instead of the shoes that they bought. Or returns a box of magazines instead of a 10-piece cookware set. If you want to see some of these fun ones, you can follow my co-founder, Evan Stalter, on LinkedIn. He posts
Yeah, I
a
was
lot
just
of
gonna say
like
that. Yeah.
return fails. It's pretty fun. But so we then build up this data set over time, right? And so today at this point, we've processed, millions of returns across millions of individual returners. And you can start to see like, hey, here's somebody whose return to stock rate is like 0%. Because they're not returning the right items, or they're returning items that are clearly been, previously enjoyed. And so start to give the brand the view of like how much of a problem is fraud for your business, right? So that's kind of number one. And that's been a lot of fun to work on. The second is then essentially giving brands more control in this process. So again, because we're integrated with the RMA providers, we can use Two Boxes inspection milestones as milestones for brands to refund against. So most of us that on the call that have refunded, returned something, put Amazon aside because the Amazon process is a little bit different because Amazon has all the data on you, even on this conversation probably right now, because I have an Alexa over here, so it's probably listening. But like, if you return to, what's a great brand that we work with? If you return to Tecovas, right? Here's actually a great example. Tecovas incredible apparel and footwear brand. Prior to working with Two Boxes, they would refund the vast majority of their customers before that actual inspection process, right? Because if you think about it, it's like, okay, well, I got to inspect all this merchandise. My 3PL is inspecting it for me. I would have to give my 3PL kind of some sort of process to tell me refund or no refund. And hey, it's a pretty slow and burdensome process, which means that I'm holding up the refund for my end consumer. So a lot of brands would say like, hey, just refund Kevin when he drops it off at UPS or when it's marked as delivered to the warehouse. The unfortunate truth is I could teach a seminar on how you defraud a retailer if they refund you at UPS, which is not that hard. But even if they refund you with the delivery scan at the warehouse, right? There's lots of different ways to defraud that. And so anyways, what we're starting to do with a lot of brands is a significant number of the highest volume brands on Two Boxes are now just waiting to see, all right, what's the inspection result in Two Boxes before I issue a refund? And then also, let's use effectively the credit history that we have on Kevin to say, hey, maybe we should refund Kevin anytime because he's a great returner, versus maybe evil Kyle. That guy shouldn't get a free return. He shouldn't even be allowed to return. Right?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting, and yeah, I mean, I love what Evan's been posting there, like some of that
great,
stuff. Yeah, like it's really, really, really interesting, right? And it's funny too because I share some of that like with my students that I teach and talking to them a little bit about that, and they're always like shocked, right? Like how much goes into returns because they don't think about it, and most consumers don't. They're like, oh, I sent it back, like that's it. I'm done with it, right? And but there's so much more like happening there, right? Which I think is really interesting. And then we have another question here. So how do you advise brands on whether to resell, refurbish, or recycle returns? Which I think we talked a little bit about, but this part of the question I think is pretty interesting. What data points influence the decision there?
Yeah. No, great question. So, a couple things we do there. So the first is, again, like, you can't improve what you can't measure, right? So the
Hmm.
first thing for us is like, get on two boxes, get a baseline of your data, right? What I mean that's relevant to this question is, what's your effectively restock rate, right? So if 100 returns come in, what's the restock rate? Do you get 80 back to stock? Do you get 90? Do you only get 50,
Mm.
right? Um, and we actually then go a lot deeper to do that at like a SKU level and so on and so forth. But let's just say like, hey, you're at a 70% return to stock rate. And then, we can use the data points on what are the underlying causes for the 30 units that don't go back to stock. Is it because Kevin's, you have a bunch of evil Kyle, sorry, who are
Yeah.
like not returning the right inventory, so you can't get that back to stock no matter what? Or is it because stuff's coming back with pet hair on it, or it's not in the right poly bag, or it's not tagged, and your 3PL today isn't providing the service, the value-added service to refurbish that inventory into a sellable state, right?
Mm.
So it's like, okay, once we have a base layer or baseline of, cool, this is what is driving your kind of yield in the return stream. Well, then, okay, well, what are the options, right? Of, hey, should you pay your 3PL to lint roll items? Should you pay your 3PL to steam those garments? Should you pay your 3PL to rebag or retag or whatever it is? Is the 3PL willing to provide those services? And then historically, we can then look at two boxes of data as well to understand the fish or the success rates
Mm.
of those services, right? Of, hey, for apparel merchants like you, 90% of the time, a spot clean is successful for removing deodorant marks, and you got a ton of deodorant marks. So like, go for it. You're going to make a lot of money, and your 3PL is going to make some money too. So that hopefully kind of gives you a gist of what we're able to do, but it all comes down to like the data of what's causing returns to not be restocked. How can you solution those? How successful are those solutions likely to be for brands like you? And is your 3PL willing to provide those services under a rate that makes sense for everybody involved? So that's a great example of like, this is a win-win, right? And really a win-win-win, right? The 3PL could make more money by helping somebody refurb, and the brand could make more money getting inventory back to stock and using their cash more efficiently. And the planet can suffer a little bit less under the weight of, billions of pounds of returns that get landfilled every year. Last point I should make on this that is really important is, two boxes does not provide, we don't provide any like direct liquidation or, resale, re-commerce ourselves, right? We don't want to do that. We don't want to mix incentives and muddy the waters. But we do integrate with several of the leading kind of like re-commerce and resale and increasingly liquidation providers, so that
Mhm.
if a brand wants to write into their SOP that items that meet this criteria can go to, Ghost or Arrive or whoever the resale provider might be, and these should go to my donation provider who's Super Circle or Liquid Donated, whoever it might be.
Mhm.
We're working on those, partnerships and integrations so that we can make it really simple for a 3PL to route that inventory into a productive manner outside of it just going into the landfill.
Interesting. Yeah. 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 And I think that's great to be able to have that. And I love too the point that you said there that, it's also measuring how effective are some of the preventative measures, right? Like you talked about the deodorant there, and you can say to the brand, like, oh, well, it's 90% effective. So like you should go after this and you should try it. It's worth the effort. Right. And I think that makes a big difference because it's hard to really understand or get visibility into that. And without something like two boxes, you're not going to have somebody there like marking how many times is steam cleaning deodorant work on like a whiteboard, right? uh
I mean,
it's just not going to happen.
legitimately, Kevin,
Yeah.
I've seen, like, to an extreme, I have seen multiple times
Mhm.
enterprise level brands who are placing their own employees in their 3PL's return sections
Yeah.
to effectively be an advisor on these types of situations.
Wow.
So, there's enough ROI in this that people are actually putting physical labor into environments to help increase restock rates, and you just
Mm.
you just don't you just don't need to do that. And that's what we're trying to help both sides with.
Yeah. Super interesting, definitely. And, very interesting always to talk to you, Kyle, and get kind of the latest on two boxes and just the returns world in general. And hopefully we were able to encourage some people to get back into that corner of the warehouse they've been avoiding today. And if they are encouraged and they see the potential now, they see the light for returns, right? What's the best way to get started with two boxes or find out
Yeah.
more information?
So a few different ways. You can go to our website and book a demo through the link there. You can email sales@twoboxes.com. And then look, people are going to find my email anyways. You can email me, Kyle@twoboxes.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. I love chatting with 3PLs and merchants. And seeing if we can be a fit for you. We're not a fit for everybody, but if we are,
Mhm.
we love to partner with folks and help everybody win in an increasingly kind of competitive and difficult ecosystem. So feel free to reach out. And Kevin, thanks so much for having me as always, man. Great to chat.
Definitely always a pleasure. And definitely go check out Two Boxes. And if you're watching on LinkedIn, you can connect with Kyle right now. He's there and he's as a speaker on the event. So thank you to everybody for tuning in here. Thanks to those that asked some questions and left some comments as well. Hopefully you're able to get some value here. And thank you once again, Kyle.
Thank you. Have a great day. See y'all.
All right. Bye.